Hey guys, today we're going to be focusing on the first part of chapter 3 from The Great Gatsby. If there's a little background noise going on, I'm not sure if it will be or not. I've got the dishwasher running right now, so hopefully that doesn't distract much with the recording of this video. But chapter 3 is where we're going to pick up today. Now, don't forget that with your chapter 2 assignment, that you needed to complete the 2 slides that I gave you for chapter 2. One that's talking about mood with the Valley of Ashes and the textual evidence that you're supposed to include with that. And then one slide that compares Daisy Buchanan with Myrtle Wilson. I went over that in detail in yesterday's assignment, so make sure that you check that out if you're unsure how to handle that assignment. Now, with chapter 3, we'll do half of it today, and we'll do the other half tomorrow. Now, you will have an interactive notebook, 1 or 2 slides to do with chapter 3, just like you have in the past. And before you start reading chapter 4, you will take your first quiz. Okay? So that quiz, today's Wednesday. That quiz will be Friday. Okay? So you will have a quiz over chapters 1 through 3 on Friday. Obviously, this is online learning, so I can't stop you from having open notes, open book sort of thing on that. So should be good grades on that when you take it on Friday. So for what we're doing today, you need to have your character charts, okay, your character notes pulled up, okay. Need to have that ready to go. And you need to have your novel notes, and I'm just going to drag this over here closer just to make it a little easier for me. And have a little heading there for chapter 3 as we start chapter 3 here. All right, so we've gone through 2 chapters of the book. This book is called The Great Gatsby, and we have had very little of Gatsby. That's going to change here in chapter 3. So we finally get to see Gatsby a little bit more in this chapter. So let's just dive right in. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach, while his 2 motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while a station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruitier in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of hopeless halves. Some good alliteration there. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. At least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers, good alliteration, came down. With several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden, on buffet tables garnished with glistening hors d'oeuvres. Garnered with glistening alliteration. Spice baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs and pastry pigs and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up and stocked with gins and liquors and with cordials so long forgotten that most of his female guests were too young to know one from another. By 7 o'clock, the orchestras arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pit full of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are parked 5 deep in the drive, and already the halls and salons and verandas are gaudy with primary colors, and their hair shone and dipped in strange new ways and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. An allusion there. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. The lights go brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier, minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then excited with triumph glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. So he's describing these parties. These parties go on all the time at Gatsby's house. Now remember that Nick lives in a little house that's right next to Gatsby's. He sees all this stuff, and all of these huge parties are going on seemingly every night at Gatsby's house. You got a huge orchestra that comes in. Several dinners are served. There's alcohol everywhere, even in the midst of Prohibition. Okay, so here we are in the midst of Prohibition. It's illegal to buy and sell alcohol, but you could go to this guy's free party and drink as much booze as you want. You can go to this guy's free party and listen to an orchestra play jazz music. Okay, remember that part of the Roaring Twenties was this influx of jazz. Okay, jazz becomes a thing in the 1920s. It's what drove these women who were flappers to go out and dance. They went and they danced to jazz music, and these parties were the epitome of the 1920s flapper lifestyle. Free alcohol, even though alcohol was supposed to be illegal, dancing, jazz music, all of it. Okay, that's what was going on at Gatsby's house. That's what's being described here in chapter 3. Suddenly one of these gypsies in trembling opals seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hands like Frisco, dances out alone on the canvas platform. A momentary hush, the orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there's a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People weren't invited, they just went there. They got into automobiles, which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and then after that, they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with amusement parks. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all, came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. I had been actually invited. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, if I would attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times and had intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Signed, J. Gatsby, in a majestic hand. So what is unique about Nick? Why would he be the only one that actually gets a formal invitation? These parties are going on all the time, but nobody actually gets invited, but Nick does. A chauffeur shows up to Nick's house and gives him a handwritten invitation from the man Gatsby himself. It's interesting. So let's go to our novel notes first here, okay? So at the start of chapter 3, Nick describes the elaborate parties that are happening at Gatsby's house. Okay, he spends a couple of pages there describing the music, describing the orange juice that was being provided, describing the alcohol that's being provided, describing the meals that are being provided, all the things that are happening at Gatsby's house. Okay, the next thing there, we got a quote, and you may see this on your quiz on Friday. At least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. I told you that it was an example of alliteration as we were going through it. Okay, caterers came down, canvas, colored lights, Christmas tree, Gatsby's garden. All of that is alliteration, but it's also a metaphor. Okay, so what's being compared here? Okay, the garden is being compared with a Christmas tree. Okay, so that's the metaphor there. As we continue on here, he describes these parties like a Disney World for adults. Okay, so if you were in your 20s and 30s in 1920, this would be like Disney World for you. Okay, there's going to be movie stars there. There's going to be free booze. There's going to be music, fireworks. You have it. You want it. It's there. Okay. So most of the people show up unannounced, but Nick receives an actual invitation, and that gets us caught up to where we are. Most of the people show up unannounced, but Nick receives an actual invitation. What is it about Nick that makes him unique enough to get an invite? All right, let's go to our character chart, and where Nick gets that, we need to add that here under important traits. Okay. So under important traits for Nick, one of the few to ever receive an invitation to Gatsby parties. Okay, one of the few to ever receive an invitation to Gatsby's parties. Okay, so all right, so let's see what happens when Nick goes to the party that night. So we're on page 46 here. Dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7 and wandered around rather ill at ease among swirls and eddies of people I didn't know, though here and there was a face I had noticed on a commuting train. Now this is once again a metaphor. Right here he says swirls and eddies of people. What are people being compared to here? Swirls and eddies. Where do you see swirls and eddies? In a river or a stream? So he's comparing people to water, like bodies of water moving around like water does. Okay, that's the metaphor there. I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low, earnest voices to solid and prosperous Americans. Now, hungry here doesn't mean, oh, I'm ready to get me some dinner at this place. No, hungry means we can make some money, and we're going to make some money off of these kids, these young adults that are here for a party. They're probably coming from some rich parents. They don't know how to manage money. We could probably make some money off these people. So hungry means that they're looking to make money, and they're talking to these prosperous Americans, looking to make that money off of them. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. They were at least agonizingly aware of the easy money in the vicinity and convinced that it was theirs for a few words in the right key. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man can linger without looking purposeless and alone. So I was on my way to getting roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I should begin to address cordial remarks to the passersby. So when Nick gets there, he does what most folks would do when they are invited to a party. They look for the host to say, oh, hey, thanks for the invite. I'm here. Nice to meet you. But nobody there seems to know where Gatsby is. And so Nick is embarrassed. He's at this party where there's probably hundreds of people there, and he doesn't know anybody, so there's free booze. Let's go ahead and drink away the awkwardness. And right as he's about to do that, he notices Jordan Baker across the way. So he's going to go and speak to her. Hello, I roared, advancing toward her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. Oh, I thought you might be here, she responded absently as I came up. I remembered you lived next door to... She held my hand impersonally as a promise she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave ear to 2 girls in twin yellow dresses who stopped at the foot of the steps. Hello, they cried together. Sorry you didn't win. That was for the golf tournament. She had lost in the finals the week before. You don't know who we are, said one of the girls in yellow, but we met you here about a month ago. Oh, you've dyed your hair since then, remarked Jordan. And I started, but the girls had moved casually on, and her remark was addressed to the premature moon, produced like the supper, no doubt, out of a caterer's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of cocktails floated at us through the twilight, and we sat down at the table with the 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. Do you come to these parties often? Inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. Oh, the last one I was at was the one I met you at, answered the girl in an alert, confident voice. She turned to her companion. Wasn't it for you, Lucille? It was for Lucille, too. I like to come, Lucille said. I never care what I do, just so as long as I have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair. He asked me my name and address, and inside of a week, I got a package from Courier's with a new evening gown in it. So she was just some random person at his house. She messed up her dress, and Gatsby buys her a new one. "Did you keep it?" asked Jordan. "Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads. $265. So a $265 dress isn't cheap in 2020. So imagine how expensive it was in 1920. We're talking probably a couple $1,000 dress that Gatsby just gives this girl. "There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that," said the other girl eagerly. "He doesn't want any trouble with anybody." "Who doesn't?" I inquired. "Gatsby. Somebody told me." The two girls and Jordan leaned together confidentially. "Somebody told me they thought he killed a man once." A thrill passed over all of us. The three Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. "I don't think it's so much that," argued Lucille skeptically. "It's more that he was a German spy during the war." "Which war?" This is in the 1920s. What war just took place? World War I. One of the men nodded in confirmation. "I heard that from a man who knew all about it. Grew up with him in Germany," he assured us positively. "Oh, no," said the first girl. "It couldn't be that, because he was in the American Army during the war." As our credulity switched back to her, she leaned forward with enthusiasm. "You look at him sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I bet he killed a man." So what are they doing? Once again, we had this in Chapter 2 with Catherine. Catherine sits down with Nick, and she starts gossiping about Gatsby. And now Nick is at Gatsby's party at Gatsby's house, and these people, one of which just received a very expensive free dress from the man, they're gossiping about Gatsby, saying that they think that he's killed a man, that they think that he's a German spy. No, he fought for America in the war. All these different rumors are flying about Gatsby. So let's go to our novel notes. I'm going to mark that there so I know where to pick back up. Let's mark our novel notes here. Okay, so Nick can't find Gatsby and decides to get drunk before he recognizes Jordan Baker. Okay, so you can add that to your notes. Okay. Then, on the next note here, Nick sits at a table with Jordan and some random people. They all begin to gossip about Gatsby. One of the girls says she thinks he's killed a man. Another says that he was a German spy during the war. Another says that he fought on the American side during the war. So all that stuff that we just talked about in the recap there, add that in your novel notes. Okay? So you can pause this for a minute and get these notes if you need to. All right, let's go to our character chart. And in our character chart, let's go to Gatsby. Okay, so we just added there. Let's go to important traits. Okay, a couple of things here that we need to add about Gatsby. That we had inner desires there, that he seems fascinated with a green light across the bay from his house. We've not had a whole lot about Gatsby. So first thing here under important traits, he throws huge parties at his house nearly every night. Okay. The next thing here, people gossip about him constantly. Okay. So those are important traits for Gatsby. He throws huge parties at his house nearly every night. People gossip about him constantly. Okay. So let's go back to the novel. Bottom of page 48. She narrowed her eyes and shivered. Lucille shivered too. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who found little that it was necessary to whisper about in this world. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now being served. And Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around a table on the other side of the garden. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's escort, so she's apparently on a date, who she's been spending time with here. a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo, and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the staid nobility of the countryside. East Egg condescending to West Egg and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic deity. So even at this party, the East Eggers are looking over at all those West Eggers and being like, oh, look at all those new money tops. Oh, they're disgusting. So even the rich looking down on the rich at a big rich party. Let's get out, whispered Jordan after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half hour. This is much too polite for me. We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way, so he's getting a hint that maybe she's not too into him as she walks away with another man. The bar where we glanced first was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library paneled with carved English oak and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. A stout middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. Believe it or not, this is going to be a fairly important character that they meet here in the library. What do you think? He demanded impetuously. About what? He waved his hands toward the bookshelves. About that! As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real. The books? He nodded. Absolutely real. They have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice, durable cardboard. As a matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages. Here. Let me show you. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. See? He cried triumphantly. It's a bona fide piece of bread and butter. Fool me. This fellow is a regular Velasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness, what realism. Knowing the stop tone didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect? So the dude's obviously drunk. He's had a little bit too much of the free booze. He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. Interesting cat that we have here. So let's add to our novel notes. Nick and Jordan go and sit with the people that Jordan came with to the party. Apparently Jordan is on a date. The group sits and looks down on all the West Eggers at the party. That's what we talked about there a minute ago. After 30 minutes or so, Jordan looks for an excuse to get away from these guys. So Jordan takes Nick to go find Gatsby. They wander into the library, and this is the scene that we just had with the drunk dude. Okay, they meet a strange, owl-eyed looking man. Okay, he's completely plastered and has been drunk for over a week. He's amazed that the books are real and seems to believe that everything at the party is fake. Okay, that's what he was talking about. Like if one brick came down, the whole castle would tumble. That's kind of what that's about there. So he's amazed that the books are real and seems to believe that everything at the party is fake. So go ahead and pause that if you need to so that you can get those notes. Okay, now if you've got those notes, let's go ahead and go over to our character chart because this guy is important enough to be included in our character chart. So scroll down past Myrtle and George Wilson. Okay. Past Catherine. Okay. Clip Springer. There he is. Allies. There we go. Okay. So he is older. Okay. Stout. Gray haired. Glasses that look like owl eyes. Okay, so that's his physical description. Inner desires. Okay, he's fascinated by the books in Gatsby's library. He thinks everything about Gatsby is fake. Okay? Important traits. Well, he said he's been drunk for over a week, so he enjoys alcohol. Okay? So, that's allies. Now let's go back to our chapter here. So, now let's see what else he says. Who brought you? He demanded. Or did you just come? I was brought. Most people were brought. Jordan looked at him alertly, cheerfully, without answering. I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt, he continued. Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her? I met her somewhere last night. I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in the library. Has it? A little bit, I think. Can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour. Did I tell you about the books? The rail! There! You told us. We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. So, no Gatsby in the library, but a strange drunk dude that looked like an owl. We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, old men pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz, and between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby acting costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating into the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. Well, he's gotten a little drunk, and now everything seems super special. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. Your face is familiar, he said politely. Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war? Oh, why, yes. I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before. We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound. Oh, what time? Any time that suits you best. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. Having a gay time now? She inquired. Oh, much better. I turned again to my new acquaintance. This is an unusual party for me. I haven't seen the host. I live over there. I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance. This man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a moment he looked at me as if he failed to understand. Now, this is the moment in the movie, you'll see it. It's where all the memes come from this movie, where Leonardo DiCaprio turns around, smiles, holds up a glass, and then fireworks go off behind him. This is where Nick realizes the guy that he's been talking to for the last 5 minutes is actually Gatsby himself. And so he says, I'm Gatsby, he said suddenly, and there you've got the music swelling and the fireworks and the smile, okay? And so Nick says, what? I beg your pardon. Oh, I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. He smiled understandingly. Now, this smile is important. It's why the movie goes into slow motion when you watch this about the smile. He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced or seemed to face the whole external world for an instant and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point, it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Sometime before he introduced himself, I'd got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. All right, so that smile, he goes on and explains that smile, that smile, that smile. Understands you, he just met you, but he understands you perfectly. And that smile just is a winning smile, okay? And then he says, when it finally snapped in, oh crap, that's Gatsby. He says he's an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, so maybe 31, 32 years old. Okay, he's very formal in the way that he speaks, almost to the point of going overboard with it. And it was like he was picking his words with care. Now, elegant young roughneck, when you think of the term roughneck, okay, that doesn't sound like somebody who is mega, mega rich. Because when you think of people that are mega, mega rich, they've probably never had to work real hard. Okay, you get calluses on your hands when you have to work hard, and you get calluses all over you from working hard, and that's indicative of somebody that could be considered a roughneck. But somebody who's 31 or 32 that owns a huge mansion and throws parties every night with all sorts of booze and musicians and things like that, they've typically had it so easy in life that they wouldn't be considered a roughneck. So that's an interesting thing about Gatsby. So let's go to our character chart. We've got some stuff now on Gatsby. Okay. All right. So let's go to physical description. Elegant, young roughneck. Okay. Elegant young roughneck, early 30s. Okay. He's in his early 30s. Elegant young roughneck, early 30s. Considered handsome. Okay. And this is going to be later on that it gives us this description. But let's go ahead and get this in the notes now while we're doing physical description. Okay, he has tanned, tight skin. Okay, tanned, tight skin. Now, let's go to important traits. Okay, he has a very understanding smile. Okay, very understanding smile. Okay, and then his speech, he's very formal in the way that he speaks. Very formal in the way that he speaks. Okay, so we've got some stuff now on Gatsby. Now we've got we've finally seen him. Nick's met him. Book's ready to get right in gear here. Okay, so let's pick back up here on page 53. Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport, he urged me. Excuse me. I'll rejoin you later. When he was gone, I returned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. So florid and corpulent, old and fat, okay, or in his middle age at least, like a robber baron for those of you in the AP class. So who is he? I demanded. Do you know? He's just a man named Gatsby. Where is he from, I mean, and what does he do? Now you're started on the subject, she answered with a wan smile. Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man. A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. So, Oxford. Oxford is a very prestigious university in England. It's like how Harvard is to us here in the United States. That's Oxford in England. Okay, very rich, very powerful, very intelligent people go to Oxford. To kind of give you a little background on Oxford to maybe make this sink into how big of a deal Oxford is. About 10 years ago or so, there was a football player for Florida State. His name was Antrell Roll. He was a very good football player, very good. Okay, projected to be a first-round draft pick in the NFL, but he gets accepted. He was also extremely intelligent and very, 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 very studious person while he was at Florida State. He actually got accepted into a grad school program at Oxford, and that's a huge deal. Okay, and he actually turns down playing in the NFL to go to Oxford. Well, that's crazy. Why would anybody do that? You'd be a millionaire if you go to the NFL. Well, yeah, you'd be a millionaire if you go into the NFL, but you're also probably going to end up with a brain injury or several other things that are going to happen to you because you put your body on the line to make that millions of dollars. Here's the thing. You go to Oxford, you complete that grad degree, you're going to become a millionaire because you have one of the most prestigious degrees on the planet without having to get brain damage in the process. So it's so prestigious that a guy turned down the NFL to go to Oxford. So kind of a big deal if Gatsby went to Oxford. And then Jordan she takes this away after she says it. She says, however, I don't believe it. Oh, why not? Oh, I don't know, she insisted. I just don't think he went there. So, odd. So let's go to our novel notes. It's been a while since we've gotten them. We may just go ahead and finish up chapter 3 in one video today. All right, so Nick gets drunk and starts conversing with a man about the war. That man turns out to be Gatsby. Gatsby is much younger than Nick expected. Gatsby invites him to ride in his hydroplane, and Jordan tells Nick that Gatsby claims to have gone to Oxford. However, she doesn't believe it. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video for a second here so that you can get your notes on that. Okay, if you're done getting the notes, let's go and add to our character chart here. So let's go to Jordan. We've not added a whole lot about Jordan Baker, but let's go ahead and get under Inner Desires. We'll put this under Inner Desires. She doesn't believe that Gatsby actually went to Oxford. Okay, so that's going to add some mystery and some intrigue about this man beyond the fact that he's 30 in his early 30s, my age or younger, and he's a freaking billionaire. The stuff that people know about him that, it may or may not be true. Okay, so she doesn't believe that Gatsby actually went to Oxford. All right, now, something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man, and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the Lower East Side of New York. That was comprehensible. But young men didn't. At least in my provincial inexperience, I believe they didn't. Drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. Anyhow, he gives large parties, said Jordan, changing the subject with an urban distaste for the concrete. I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. All right, so that's a good one right there. And I like large parties. They're so intimate. That's an oxymoron. Okay, how are large parties intimate? Well, in a large party, you can talk to one person and nobody's going to bother you. If you're at a small party, you got to talk to all 10 people. So this is also a paradox. Something that seems impossible but is actually true is a paradox, and it seems impossible that a large party could be intimate, but it is. Okay, and we've talked about paradoxes before. An example of a paradox would be the movie Back to the Future. How can you go back to the future? You go back to the past, but whenever you've gone to the past, if you're getting back home, you got to go back to the future. It's a paradox, something that seems impossible but is true. All right, so anyway, back to page 54. There was a boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the ukulele of the garden. Ladies and gentlemen, he cried, at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tostoff's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation. He smiled with jovial condescension and added, some sensation, whereupon everybody laughed. The piece is known, he concluded lustily, as Vladimir Tolstoy's Jazz History of the World. The nature of Mr. Tostoff's composition eluded me because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set him off from his guests, for it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. When the jazz history of the world was over, girls were putting their heads on men's shoulders in puppyish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backward playfully into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls. But no one swooned backward on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. I beg your pardon. Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. Miss Baker, he inquired. I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone. With me? She exclaimed in surprise. Yes, madame. She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress like all her dresses, like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movements, as if she had just first learned to walk upon golf courses on clean, crisp mornings. All right, so Gatsby wants to talk to Jordan alone. Okay, so we got some more stuff there about Gatsby. Let's go to our character chart. And Gatsby. Okay, we learned that he doesn't drink. Okay, so he got all this free booze at his house, all these people around him that drink. He doesn't. He doesn't drink. So that's something that kind of stands out about him. So under important traits, under important traits, he does not drink alcohol. He does not drink alcohol. Now, I was alone, and it was almost 2. For some time, confused and intriguing sounds had issued from a long, many-windowed room which overhung the terrace. Eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him, I went inside. The large room was full of people. One of the girls in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus engaged in song. She had drunk a quantity of champagne, and during the course of her song, she had decided ineptly that everything was so very, very sad. She was not only singing, she was weeping too. Whenever there was a pause in the song, she filled it with gasping, broken sobs, and then looked up the lyric again in a quavering soprano. The tears coursed down her cheeks, not freely, however, for when they came into contact with her heavily beaded eyelashes, they assumed an inky color, and pursued the rest of the way in slow black rivulets. A humorous suggestion was made that she sing the notes on her face, whereupon she threw up her hands, sank into a chair, went off to a deep, venuous sleep. She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband, explained a girl at my elbow. I looked around. Most of the remaining women were now having fights with men said to be their husbands. Even Jordan's party, the quartet from East Egg, were rent asunder by dissension. One of the men was talking with curious intensity to a young actress, and his wife, after attempting to laugh at the situation in a dignified and indifferent way, broke down entirely and resorted to flank attacks. At intervals, she appeared suddenly at his side like an angry diamond and hissed, "You promised," into his ear. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. The hall was at present occupied by 2 deplorably sober men and their highly indignant wives. The wives were sympathizing with each other in slightly raised voices. "Whenever he sees I'm having a good time, he wants to go home. Never heard anything so selfish in my life. We're always the first ones to leave." "So are we. And we're almost the last tonight," said one of the men sheepishly. "The orchestra left half an hour ago." In spite of the wives' agreement that such malevolence was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle, and both wives were lifted kicking into the night. As I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened and Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. Jordan's party was calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. "I've just heard the most amazing thing," she whispered. "How long were we in there?" "About an hour." "Oh, it was simply amazing," she repeated abstractedly. "But I swore I wouldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you." She yawned gracefully in my face. "Please come and see me. Phone book under the name of Mrs. Sigourney Howard, my aunt." She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into the party at the door. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I'd hunted for him early in the evening and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. "Oh, don't mention it," he enjoined me eagerly. "Don't give it another thought, old sport." The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder. "And don't forget, we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Then the butler behind his shoulder. "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir." "All right, in a minute. Tell them I'll be right there. Good night." "Good night." "Good night." He smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. "Good night, old sport. Good night." But as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. In the ditch beside the road, right side up but violently shorn of one wheel, rested a new coupe which had left Gatsby's drive about 2 minutes before. The sharp jut of a wall accounted for the detachment of the wheel, which was now getting considerable attention from half a dozen curious chauffeurs. However, as they had left their cars blocking the road, a harsh discordant din from those in the rear had been audible for some time and added to the already violent confusion of the scene. So apparently there's a wreck in Gatsby's driveway. Let's get some notes. All right, so Gatsby wants to speak with Jordan alone. Jordan comes back and says that Gatsby told her something amazing, but she promised not to say anything about it. Nick waits to say goodnight to Gatsby, and there is a car accident in the front of the house. The front wheel fell off, and the two drunk men in the car are completely confused, and we'll get the rest of that here in a minute. So go ahead and get these notes right here. Go ahead and pause and get these bullet points right here, and then unpause, and we will pick back up in the book. All right, now, so a man in a long duster had dismounted from the wreck and now stood in the middle of the road, looking from the car to the tire and from the tire to the observers in a pleasant way. But he was puzzled. "See," he explained, "well, went in the ditch." The fact was infinitely astonishing to him, and I recognized first the unusual quality of wonder, and then the man. It was a late patron of Gatsby's library. "How did it happen?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I know nothing whatever about mechanics," he said decisively. "But how did it happen? Did you run into the wall?" "Don't ask me," said Owl Eyes, washing his hands of the whole matter. "I know very little about driving. There's nothing. It happened, that's all I know." "Well, if you're a poor driver, you ought not to try driving at night." "But I wasn't even trying. I wasn't even trying." An odd hush fell upon the bystanders. "Do you want to commit suicide?" "Oh, you're lucky it was just a wheel. A bad driver and not even trying." "You don't understand. I wasn't driving. There was another man in the car." The shock that followed this declaration found voice in a sustained "ah" as the door of the coupe swung slowly open. The crowd, it was now a crowd, stepped back in voluntarily. When the door had opened wide, there was a ghostly pause. Then very gradually, part by part, a pale, dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with a large, uncertain dancing shoe. All right, so we've got this car accident, and it involves Owl Eyes. And people thought he was driving. He says, "I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car." Okay, so the front wheel fell off. They can't figure out that the front wheel fell off. And they're completely confused by this whole mess. Okay, so The shock that followed this declaration found voice in a sustained "ah" as the door of the coupe swung slowly open. The crowd, it was now a crowd, stepped back in voluntarily, and when the door opened wide, there was a ghostly pause. Then, very gradually, part by part, a pale, dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with a large, uncertain dancing shoe. Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of the horns, the apparition stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. "What's the matter?" he inquired calmly. "I guess. Look!" Half a dozen fingers pointed at the amputated wheel. He stared at it for a moment and then looked upward as though he suspected that it had dropped from the sky. "It came off," someone explained. He nodded. "First I didn't know it would stop." A pause, then taking another long breath and straightening his shoulders, he remarked in a determined voice, "Tell me where's Gatsby Station?" At least a half a dozen men, some of them a little better off than he was, explained to him that the wheel and car were no longer joined by any physical bond. "Well, but back out," he suggested after a moment. "Put her in reverse." "But the wheel's off," he hesitated. "No harm in trying," he said. The caterwauling horns had reached a crescendo, and I turned back away and cut across the lawn toward home. I glanced back once. A wafer of a moon was shining over Gatsby's house, making the night fine as before and surviving the laughter and the sound of his still glowing garden. A sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host who stood on the porch, his hand up in a formal gesture of farewell. Reading over what I have written so far, I see I have given the impression that the events of 3 nights, several weeks apart, were all that absorbed me. On the contrary, they were merely casual events in a crowded summer, and, until much later, they absorbed me infinitely less than my personal affairs. Most of the time I worked. In the early morning, the sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasms of lower New York to the Probity Trust. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names and lunched with them in dark, crowded restaurants on little pig sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I even had a short affair with a girl who lived in Jersey City and worked in the accounting department, but her brother began throwing mean looks in my direction. So when she went on her vacation in July, I let it blow away quietly. I took dinner usually at the Yale Club. For some reason, it was the gloomiest event of my day. Probably because everybody else at the Yale Club was mega rich and he hadn't made it yet. And then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for a conscientious hour. There were generally a few rioters around, but they never came around into the library, so it was a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue past the old Murray Hill Motel and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. I began to like New York, the racy, adventurous feel of it at night and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eye. I liked to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd and imagine that in a few minutes I was going to enter into their lives, and no one would ever know or disapprove. Sometimes in my mind I followed them to their apartments on the corners of hidden streets, and they turned and smiled back at me before they faded through a door into warm darkness. At the enchanted metropolitan twilight I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others. Poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows, waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner. Young clerks in the dusk, waiting the most poignant moments of night and life. Again at 8 o'clock, when the dark lanes of the 40s were 5 deep with throbbing taxicabs, bound for the theater district, I felt a sinking in my heart. Forms leaned together in the taxis as they waited, and voices sang, and there was laughter from unheard jokes, and lighted cigarettes outlined in unintelligible gestures inside, imagining that I too was hurrying toward gaiety and sharing their intimate excitement. I wished them well. For a while, I lost sight of Jordan Baker, and then in the midsummer I found her again. At first I was flattered to go places with her because she was a golf champion and everyone knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. The bored, haughty face that she turned to the world concealed something. Most affectations conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning, and one day I found out what it was. When we were on a house party together up in Warwick, she left a borrowed car out in the rain with the top down, and then lied about it. And suddenly I remembered the story about her that had eluded me that night at Daisy's. At her first big golf tournament, there was a row that nearly reached the newspapers, a suggestion that she had moved her ball from a bad lie in the semifinal round. The thing approached the proportions of a scandal, then died away. A caddy retracted his statement, and the only witness admitted that he might have been mistaken. The incident and the name that remained together in my mind. Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men, and now I saw that this was because she felt safer on a plane where any divergence from a code would be thought impossible. She was incurably dishonest. She wasn't able to endure being at a disadvantage, and given this unwillingness, I suppose she had begun dealing in subterfuges when she was very young in order to keep that cool, insolent smile turned to the world, and yet satisfy the demands of her hard, jaunty body. It made no difference to me. Dishonesty in a woman is never a thing that you blame deeply. I was casually sorry, and then I forgot. It was on the same house party that we had a curious conversation about driving a car. It started because she passed so close to some workmen that our fender flicked a button on one man's coat. Now, you're a rotten driver, I protested. Either you ought to be more careful or you ought not to drive at all. I am careful. No, you're not. Well, other people are, she said lightly. Well, what's that got to do with it? Don't keep out of my way, she insisted. It takes two to make an accident. Suppose you met somebody just as careless as yourself. I hope I never will, she answered. I hate careless people. That's why I like you. Her gray, sun-strained eyes stared straight ahead, but she had deliberately shifted our relations, and for a moment I thought I loved her. But I am slow-thinking and full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires, and I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangle back home. You know, the girl that he was almost engaged to in Wisconsin. I'd been writing letters once a week and signing, Love, Nick, and all I could think of was how when that certain girl played tennis, a faint mustache of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. Nevertheless, there was a vague understanding that had to be tactfully broken off before I was free. Everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I'm one of the few honest people that I have ever known. All right, so here he is. He's basically dating Jordan Baker, but he says that he can't come right out and say that he's in love with her until he breaks up with the girl back home in Wisconsin. And then he ends the chapter with, I'm one of the few honest people that I have ever known. A little bit of irony there, okay? So we got to get some stuff for our character chart. Let's go to Jordan first, okay, because we found out some stuff there about Jordan. Okay, inner desires. She hates careless people. And that is why she likes Nick. Dum-dum-dum. Okay. Important traits. She begins dating Nick Carraway. Okay. Now let's scroll up to Nick. All right. Under inner desires, says that he cannot allow himself to fall in love with Jordan until he breaks up with the girl back in Wisconsin. Okay. Under important traits for Nick, okay, he thinks. Now, whether or not he is, the book will determine that, but we've already had some hints that maybe he's not. He thinks he is a very honest person. Okay? So, that finishes out what we need to get from our character chart from today, as we ended up getting all the way through chapter 3. Now let's get our novel notes here that finish out the chapter. So as Nick leaves, he sees Gatsby waving farewell. And then Nick says that there were many other things going on in his life that summer besides the 3 nights that he's described so far. Those 3 nights being the night that he went over to Tom and Daisy's house, the night that he went to the apartment with Tom and met Myrtle, and then the night at Gatsby's party. He said there's a lot of other stuff besides those 3 nights. He says that he works a lot, that he made friends with his co-workers, had a short affair with a girl from the office. He began to feel lonely, and he starts dating Jordan Baker. He realizes that she is dishonest. So go ahead and pause your video here and get those notes, and then when you unpause, I'll move on. All right, so he also says that it doesn't bother him that she's dishonest. Jordan is a terrible driver. She says that she hates careless people, and that's why she likes Nick. Go ahead and pause and get that. Well, let's finish this out. Nick says that he might love Jordan, but he still hasn't officially broken up with the girl back in Wisconsin. So pause, get those notes. Okay, now that you've unpaused, let's go and get, I said we were done with the character chart. There's still some stuff that we need to get about Jordan that I had left out. So let's go back down to Jordan Baker under important traits. Okay. Okay. Under inner desires, and we'll put this as an well, no, we're going to put this as a character, an important trait. It's a trait about who she is as a person. All right, so under important traits, she is incurably dishonest. She's a liar and she'll never stop. Okay, and also under important traits, she is a terrible driver. Now, one of the themes of this book is carelessness. Okay, carelessness is a theme of this book, and I may not have mentioned that yet, but we've had some examples of carelessness so far. Okay, Tom is careless with Daisy, cheats on her. Okay, Myrtle is careless with her relationship with her husband George. She cheats on him with Tom. Okay, Nick is careless because he's dating a girl while he still is writing Love Nick to some girl back in Wisconsin. Okay, a lot of carelessness in this novel already, and you're going to see more examples of that as we work our way through. All right, so that finishes up chapter 3.